This week's episode is sponsored by Bespoke Exterior Specialist Trades. We're a home improvements company in Glasgow who take no upfront payments and there's a finance option available as well. We cover all aspects of roofing. We're wall specialists. We do rough casting, smooth rendering, wall coatings. We're also solar specialists as well.
I mean, if there's one person in the family who's got addiction issues, but everybody else is supportive and can help you, it may be you're going to survive that better, but if you're a kid and both your parents have got addiction problems, it must be really, really difficult. I mean, I was lucky because I had people around about me who weren't alcoholics, What's the point in giving somebody a drug problem 3 months imprisonment or 4 months imprisonment? You're much better putting them on a programme and trying to help them. And I think with the proper resources, there probably would be more of that at Sheriff Court level. I get the impression the resources is a problem. There are people in Barlini waiting for their trial really because they don't have anywhere to stay, just because they're homeless. So they don't have an address to offer. Or, they had a conviction for assault 20 years ago when they were 16 and, the reasons they find to remand people who don't really need to be remanded.
Like, see the Tommy Robinson case, I don't agree with Tommy Robinson, like, with his politics, I don't agree with him, but what they're doing to him in the prison, the solitary confinement and all that, I don't agree with that.
I actually agree with imprisoning him in as a start. I think the sentence is grossly excessive. But, I'm not sure there was an understanding really of what he did. I mean, getting a finding against you, so basically the court has intervened to say, we don't think you told the truth when you said these things about this kid. And then the police just ignored the guidelines. And when we went to the appeal court and said, and they said, well, they're just guidelines. So what's the point in having them?
So, welcome to Social Sessions. Today we're joined with Tommy Ross, one of the top KCs in Scotland. How you doing, Tommy?
Very good. Happy to be here.
So what I'll do, Tommy, just like kind of everybody else, will take you back your childhood. So where did you grow up?
Born in Govan. We stayed in Shield Hall Road in Govan, but by the time I started school, we had moved about a mile up the road to the high flats in Cardonald. So I grew up in Cardonald, really, and went to the local schools in Cardonald and Penally.
It's quite unique that you've obviously got that kind of working class background in the kind of high position you hold. Is it as unique as I think, or
not unique and probably not quite as unusual as you might expect it? But I mean, it's still there's still a high representation of private school people, the faculty in particular. But I would think even amongst the judiciary now, there are many people who went to state schools.
Aye. So what was your kind of school like and what kind of took you into law? Where did you kind of get your inspiration from?
Well, I mean, I've only really started talking about this recently, but my dad got to jail when I was about 6 and he'd get involved in a fight with the police when he was drunk and he'd get 60 days and obviously was taken away. And it's impossible to imagine that never had some impact on it, because there was nobody I had 2 sisters, neither of whom had any interest in the law or university or anything. So it kind of came from nowhere, I'd never met a lawyer. I didn't know anybody who had a lawyer. So I suspect maybe it was influenced by the fact there was kind of perceived injustice that you get a bit of kicking off the police, get 6 or 7 broken ribs and ended up in the jail for his first offence. So I suppose that probably had an influence on the whole decision to get involved in it.
No, and I think, I mean, we talk often on this podcast about kind of trauma and traumatising events. And as a kid, it's traumatising when you see things like that. Do you know what I mean?
It is, and I've read the accounts that I gave of it. Really, I was obviously concerned that it might be held against me because all I really wanted from the system, I was desperate to be a QC, because obviously that gets you into the more serious cases, and I had this notion that, you know, in a way it was bad enough that I was at a state school, but if they found out my dad was in Barani as well, you know, that might not help. But also, I've got two sisters, and they never talked about it, and they were in quite good jobs.
Aye.
And so I didn't want to make things any more difficult for them, you know, but fortunately it all kind of came together. I took Silk in 2017, and by that point, both my sisters had retired, and I thought I could speak about it. But I was actually there when he got arrested. It was a strange situation because him and my mum used to drink a lot at the weekend, and me and my sister get kind of sent into, it was a kind of surrogate granny in Govan, and she used to watch us for the weekend while all the chaos was going on back at home. But he occasionally would come and try and get me, you know. He'd always wanted a boy, and he was very, very fond of me. So every now and again at the weekend he would get drunk and turn up, want to take me away, you know. And my granny wouldn't let him take me away, and one of the neighbours phoned, so the cops turned up. We were in the house, and you could tell there was, well, I mean, he was a fighter, you know, so I don't blame them. I'm sure he probably started it, but it was kind of traumatic because he went to court, and, you know, obviously they weren't telling me what was going on. I can't remember.
What age were you telling me?
6.
6.
And I wouldn't have remembered I was 6, but he never really got over it. And he used to talk about the fact that he was in the van going to Barani the day the Queen Mother opened the Kingston Bridge. So obviously I was able, when I was a bit older, to check Wikipedia, and I think it was 1970, the summer of 1970. So he disappeared. To be honest, we were probably glad because, you know, when he was on the drink, he was a real handful. He was never ever bad to me, but, you know, he would just disappear and go on it for 2 or 3 days. And so I think that must have been pretty influential in my decision. But I mean, I was quite good at school. I was quite well behaved, and I get stuck in and did my exams and all that. So it would have been something I would have considered anyway. I just don't know. What I do know is I was telling people when I was at primary school that I was going to be a lawyer, and that must be seen as unusual, I think. So you know, it probably that's the reason I got into it. But once I decided I was doing it, I was pretty determined.
No, I think it's really inspiring, and it's coming from like a position yourself where it is kind of held as a kind of power position, and being open and honest about kind of that traumatic background, because I mean it's so rife now, do you know what I mean? And it really does leave a lasting kind of scar. And I don't think Scotland's doing enough. I don't think the world's doing enough to kind of look into trauma. It's all right being saying trauma informed, but when you go through the courts, it is really traumatizing, like the whole thing. Do you know what I mean? And
you know, I always think I've completely got over it. You know, I mean, I've got a great career, I've got a great family and all that, and I never really think about it. But, you know, strangely enough, last year, my wife and I went to see the Amy Winehouse movie, and obviously, you know, she had her addiction issues. And I was really upset about it, you know, and in a way, I think I was kind of, you know, it was kind of bringing things back, you know, from when I was growing up watching it, because my mum left when I was 8, and to be honest, I think we were kind of glad she left, because the two of them used to knock hell at each other, you know, and at least that problem was kind of solved. But neither one of them made it to their 70s, you know, they both drank themselves to death. So
I'm sorry to hear that. And it's like, it's that old story when at that time, it was kind of not acceptable. I'm not saying acceptable, but it was kind of what everybody done. It was like, it was the kind of Glasgow, and you worked hard, the guy worked hard, and then went out at the weekend, and it just spirals. And I think it's generational trauma. And I think you've broke that, but a lot of families don't, Tommy. A lot of families, the trauma continues. Do you know what I mean? And they've not been, you've broke that cycle for your family, which is amazing. But there's so many families out there that is just generational. You'll probably see it yourself as a lawyer. You're defending a dad, and you're defending the son, and so does that happen kind of like a lot? You see kind of different members of families, and
you know, we were talking. One of my pals is an office in Drumchapel, and we were talking about that, and I remember when I was a solicitor at the same time, I was acting for the mum, the dad, the son, and the granddad. We had cases for 4 of them all at the same time, you know. So I think that's an answer to your question. The mum and dad had addiction issues. The granddad was just a repeat disqualified driver, to be honest. But obviously, you could see the way the boy was going, been brought up with 2 people with massive addiction problems. You know, his outcome for him wasn't expected to be good, and he was already in quite serious bother when he was kind of 14, 15, you know.
I think, I mean, the courts are, there's some courts are doing, like, I know, like, some of the sheriff courts are starting to kind of look at trauma as a mitigating factor and maybe, like, addiction issues and stuff like that, and going a wee bit easier on it. And then, I don't know, like Lord Turnbull, right, but, I mean, his paper on the under 25 things, I think, was great. I think that was I don't know about how you feel about that, the under...
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of that when you were talking about trauma, because in the young person sentencing guideline, which is what you're referring to, there are a variety of factors which the court are directed to take into account, particularly in the case of young people. And one of them is adverse childhood experiences. And, you know, I've certainly had one case where an expert in relation to that was prepared to meet the accused and discuss the adverse childhood experiences and do a report. And it was really, really helpful. And I've actually contacted her recently to see if she would do the same thing in a different case. And it is, you know, it is definitely a breakthrough that it's listed in a sentencing guideline as something that the court has to take into account, because then if you get the report, you know, the judge has no option but to read it and to have regard to it. And if you're not happy with the sentence, of course, you can appeal it and refer to the report in the appeal. And obviously, even if you don't have a report from an independent expert, if it's a decent social worker, then it will be picked up in the social work report.
No, I think, like, I often say, like, the working class is, like, there's a lot of, most crime is committed to the working class. I mean, if you take sexual offences away, most come from the deprived areas, and most people, if you heard the backstory of that person, and that, if you take them right back, and I know it's hard for some people to do it, but if you take them right back and you see that wee boy that's getting, or the wee lassie that's getting the abuse or whatever, you would never treat them the way you treat them later on in life. Do you know what I mean? And
absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the point. I mean, if there's one person in the family who's got addiction issues, but everybody else is supportive and can help you, maybe you're going to survive that better, you know. But if you're a kid and both your parents have got addiction problems, it must be really, really difficult. I mean, I was lucky because I had people run about me who weren't alcoholics, you know. I had 2 sisters and a family friend who I've always called my auntie, but, you know, I had good people who could take me out of the situation and kind of look after me. And it wasn't, you know, imagine if you're a heroin addict, that's an everyday situation, whereas, you know, my dad wasn't drinking every day. He was a kind of binge drinker, so he'd go for weeks and he'd go to his work and behave normally, and then he would just go right on it for another week and end up in Levendale or the Southern General or something. So there was breaks as well, you know. So it must be way harder when there's just nobody who's really acting, you know, in your interests all the time. I always had that.
No, I thought obviously, like you were mentioning heroin there, but cocaine is like, it's massive now. It's like, I mean, it used to be that you would kind of see, like, I don't mean this in a bad way, because I'm really empathetic and sympathise with everybody, especially in addiction, but you used to maybe be able to see that the person was dishevelled or whatever and looked. See now, when you're working with people or you see people, it's people that just look like as if they were nicely dressed, and that, but cocaine's so psychological, and I don't think they really know what they're doing, and I think it's causing a lot of kind of back crime. I mean, have you seen a change in that kind of way where?
Oh, 100%. Aye. I mean, in the 80s and the 90s, all the high court cases were heroin. And the trend, even the kind of major dealers who are getting caught, you get the impression the main business is cocaine, but they'll have a kind of backup of heroin in case anybody asks for it. But it's not by any means the main. 100%, the Class A drug cases at the High Court, the vast majority of them are cocaine as the central issue.
I think it's the scary thing is, Tommy, is the stuff that's been mixed with now. It's like when I was growing up and stuff like that, like it was a cocaine and that was about, but it was like was cocaine. Do you know what I mean? And but now you're getting like ketamine and fentanyl and metanitazines and stuff, like really scary drugs. Do you know what I mean? That people don't really know what they're doing, and I just don't know if Scotland's kind of ready for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost legalised possession of it. You know, I mean, the minute the Lord Advocate said that the police find you in possession of cocaine, they no longer need to report you to Crown Office. They can just give you a police caution or a police fine or something like that. And that takes a lot of people who might have got help in the past out the system. You know, in other words, if you go to court for cocaine and the judge might put you in a drug treatment and testing order or something like that. But, you know, if you're not going to court any longer, then I suppose there is a danger that those people just don't get any assistance from anybody, you know. So, and I think the harm that's been caused by it is increasing in line with the use, you know. I think there were maybe about 200 cocaine deaths, you know, 10, 15 years ago, and now it's 1,000 or 2,000. It was a lot. But in addition, I watched a lecture by Julie McAdam, who is one of the pathologists at Glasgow University, and she was explaining that obviously she sees people who have died, but they don't think the death is cocaine related, but they're seeing huge, many examples of stress on the heart. You know, that people who have damaged their heart and are probably only a short time away from killing themselves with cocaine, and then they get hit with a bus, or you know, they die of some infection or something. But the pathologist can see the harm it's doing. It's not just the people who die through congenital cocaine ingestion. It's people who are on the road and then die of something else before they get there. So there's no doubt the more use there is of it, there'll be more deaths. I don't doubt that for a second.
No, I think like it's going to get worse before it gets better, and I think, I don't know what you might be able to kind of help us with, and that's Tommy, but I don't know what at the higher kind of levels of law, I don't know what people are thinking about the safe consumption room. What was the kind of views of that? Do you know, like?
Well, I mean, I thought if we had unlimited resources, if it saved somebody's life, it was worth it. The reality is we don't have unlimited resources, and obviously only a certain amount of money is going to be devoted to dealing with drug problems. I'm in favour of, having seen a few examples of it, a complete abstinence with medication, you know, a kind of short treatment to try and get people off it completely, rather than keeping people on it for life, you know. So that's what I think. I think it would be a great idea if it was a gateway for people to get proper rehabilitation.
Like rehab or something, definitely.
But I don't think there's any evidence of that. I don't think there's the resources to do it. So, I also wondered, I've got to say, whether people who stayed in Drumchapel or Pollock or Govan or, you know, would travel all the way to the Barras to go to the safe consumption room. I think that unlikely. I would imagine if you're addicted, then you're going to try and ingest the drugs as quickly as possible. You're not going to get a bus to Drumchapel into the town and another one out to the East End.
No,
you know?
You're not getting up in the morning and going, I'm going to travel away in there. Do you know what I mean? It costs money and everything, and then you've got the chance of getting caught with it. And there's so many things. I mean, Dorothy Bain had put a kind of thing on where she was kind of vague on it. I think we saying like people won't be kind of lifted round about it, but that then causes problems where you maybe get people down there like selling stuff and stuff like that. Do you know what I mean?
They're going,
and then obviously you can stand outside and you've got a customer base, haven't you?
To be fair to her, I mean, she was just asked the question: if people are in the centre consuming drugs, are they going to be prosecuted in those circumstances? So, you know, and she gave the answer that she's entitled to make that kind of policy decision. I think it would be difficult for her to envisage all the circumstances, and you've identified some of them. You know, if you're just hanging about, running about the Barras trying to sell drugs and you get caught, can you say, well, I'm going to the safe consumption room? You know, I don't know the answer to that. But I think the reality is, unless they had substantial evidence that you were dealing these days, if they thought you were just in possession of drugs, I'm not sure you would even get reported to the fiscal anyway, you know, the way things are.
No, I think, like, I don't know if you know Anne-Marie Ward and that.
I do,
Anne-Marie, like, is a big advocate for, and I think she talks a lot of sense on this subject. And it's one of these things. We done a podcast on the safe consumption room, and we all kind of came to the conclusion that it wasn't a good idea, and the money could be better spent. And I think harm reduction's got its place. Like, it definitely does. We all know that. We're not saying that Scotland's not got drug problems, but I think in a way, £2 million a year, and even £70,000 a year for a prisoner, you're 20 grand a year for rehab, and this is what these guys need, because they need to be took right back to the root childhood problems and work through these things.
Yeah. Now, I agree with almost everything that Anne-Marie Ward says on the subject, you know, and she's not frightened to say it either, which is what we need. And obviously there's a lot of people who have been kind of taken in-house by the Scottish Government and various focus groups and so on, and imagine they're unlikely to be critical of Scottish Government policy once they're taken indoors. So some people like Anne-Marie who know what they're talking about and are not frightened are not intimidated by Scottish Government policy. We need more people like that. I'm not, you know, to be fair to the judiciary, I'm not sure what can be done at High Court level, because generally speaking, the offences are far too serious for them to consider a non-custodial option. I know they've done fantastic work in the drugs court at Glasgow Sheriff Court, which is much more centred to trying to help people get off it, or at least to manage the issue. And everybody, I'm not at the Sheriff Court very often, but they spoke very highly, for example, of Sheriff Lindsay Wood, sadly no longer with us, but, you know, he was really down to earth, and we get people in and give them a pep talk, and, you know, and everybody who dealt with him, you know, believed that he'd managed to save a lot of people, you know, which is what at that level, you know, what's the point in giving somebody with a drug problem 3 months imprisonment or 4 months imprisonment? You know, you're much better putting them on a programme and trying to help them. And I think with the proper resources, there probably would be more of that at Sheriff Court level. I get the impression the resources is a problem.
I mean, I might be wrong in saying this, Tommy, right? But I think because of your background and probably that, I mean, obviously we were saying it's no unique, but it's no, there is probably a lot of people at that higher level that don't really know what's going on in the streets, or haven't got that kind of lived experience, and they're only listening to, like I say, Scottish Government or council or whatever, who are maybe getting paid, and I think even these people are disconnected from the reality of the situation.
I mean, it's inevitable, I suppose. I don't know if the medical profession is the same, but undoubtedly the children of lawyers, by quite a high proportion, go on to become lawyers themselves, you know, so it's kind of self-perpetuating. And, you know, I mean, although I grew up in that background, my kids didn't, you know, so, you know, they've never had any experience of ever meeting anybody with addiction issues or something. So that's identifies the problem, really. You know, the further away you get from it, you're not, once you've, you know, if you're working as a lawyer, the likelihood is you're going to move to an area where these issues are not so much of a, you know, a problem, and you know, the next generation are not going to be exposed to it. So maybe unless people from, you know, a non-traditional background, as the Law Society tend to call it, unless more people get involved in the law, and which is something I'm very keen on encouraging, you know, there is a danger that the legal profession is just too remote for the problem, really understand it.
No, I think that's bang on, Tommy. I think you've got to be connected with the problem, and I don't know if it's like kind of listening to lived experience as much as, I'm not saying there's not, like, obviously you need policy, you need clever people in there that are going to write like laws and whatever, but you also need to know what's happening, do you know what I mean, in the situation, because most of it is underpinned by trauma. Like, most of what's going on, most of the crime that's committed is underpinned by trauma. And I think that's, so to me, the big problem is poverty, and then you look at why we know. I don't know. It's just like, I mean, there's got guys now with £400 billion in the bank, and you've got like poverty stereos still, and I don't know. People are like thinking these guys are going to be saviours. I don't get it. It's not my thing, but I don't know what you think about that in the way that you think there's the inequality is an issue.
It's a big issue. I mean, every country in the world's wrestling with the same problem, and nobody's really found a solution to it, But undoubtedly, if you go to Postal or something, and you see the way people are living, it's unsurprising that, they develop problems in terms of their behaviour and get into gangs and get involved in drugs. It's no difficult to understand it. The bigger problem is, what do you do about it? If you're growing up in a place where that is normal, which it's normal for people to be taking heroin when they're 15, then I suppose it's a million times harder to get out of that environment than it would be if you were the only person in the area doing it. But it's, in Glasgow's big city with big problems in various different parts of it. So it's a massive job for anybody to turn it around, and it may be
Definitely.
all you can do is help at the moment, all we can do is help the people who have got the problems directly.
No, obviously, but I mean, there's baby steps into it, and it is just like, well, I think things are maybe kind of starting to move, and there is two sides to the story. There's always you've got victims as well there. Do you know what I mean? Who are wanting justice and stuff. So, but I done a podcast with Chris Daw. I don't know if you know Chris Daw. He's a case leader in England, and lovely guy, really nice. And he was just basically saying, like, down there, like, we need to rip the whole system up and start again. But that was only his opinion. But when I was talking about it, I was saying about the victims. He says, but I don't. He says the victims shouldn't have any say. And he says, I'm not saying they shouldn't have, but the law is supposed to go unbiased.
Yeah.
And I never looked at it for that way. And I was like, and they should be able to have their but no drive it. Do you know what I mean? No drive, like policy.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to, it's really difficult because you've got to separate the two issues. And the first issue is giving the person who's suspected of the crime a fair trial. So definitely at that point, any consideration for the victim should not impact on the fairness of the trial. But it's different, of course. Once somebody pleads guilty or is convicted, then obviously people would support victims. But it is, we saw a very good example of it. I think a lot of people who would regard themselves as very liberal in relation to social issues are far less liberal when it comes to prison,
Definitely.
and particularly when the offending has either affected them or their family directly, or alternatively, it's just a cause that they feel very passionate about. And, I've been invited on to news programmes, for example, when the early release scheme came in, and, people don't like it. People think, there was nothing else. And I'm critical from time to time of the Scottish government and criminal justice, but there was literally nothing else they could do. The jails were full. They had to find an early way to let people out. But yet you've got victim support on BBC Radio Scotland saying, oh no, we're not in favour of this, and that's just going to create more victims. And sadly, the possibility is that it might, but, it's difficult for the government, because if they solve the problem, and they're not entirely blameless for the problem developing over many, many years, but whether I'm right or wrong about that, if it gets to the stage where the governors are saying, look, you just need to find a way to let people out, and they're being criticised then by, the kind of victims lobby, where do you go with it? Because they're probably more interested in getting votes for people who are sympathetic to the victims lobby than they are the type of guys, who are in and out of Berlin, 3-4 times a year, who maybe don't even bother voting or are in prison at the time when the election comes round. So it's really, really difficult, and everybody you talk to who's remotely liberal thinks that we jail too many people, that there should be alternatives to custody, until it's the guy who broke into their house or stole their car or something, and then it's jail him for as long as possible and don't give him any remission. That sadly, that is the position that people who you would probably be liberal in relation to other issues, tend not to be when it comes to imprisonment.
No, I think you're bang on again, and it is a very complex issue, and it's one of the ones where you've got like obviously like victims always have a place, and I think it's just one of the ones where it just goes back to poverty. It's like
I mean, the other factor which nobody really mentions, it's estimated in the High Court that about 75 to 80% of the trials are sex offences. That's a lot, So every day, if there are 8 trial courts in the High Court, there might be 5 or 6, dealing with very, very serious sex offences. Now, nobody's suggesting that imprisonment's not appropriate for that,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what the figure is. I think in England it was estimated it might be 25% of the prison population or sex offences or something. So you can't let them out, Nobody's suggesting that. And then in the High Court, obviously, you've got murders, attempted murders, drug importation, And so there's quite a lot of crimes, certainly the ones that I come across, where nobody would be happy if there was no imprisonment involved in it. But of course, the public are not happy either if people are released after half their sentence or 40% or whatever, So it's not an easy problem for the Scottish government to solve. They don't have a lot of money to throw at alternatives to custody. Personally, I think they could be doing a lot more in terms of remand.
Mm-hmm.
There are people in custody, still in Scotland, there are people in Barlinnie waiting for their trial, really because they don't have anywhere to stay, just because they're homeless. So they don't have an address to offer, or, they had a conviction for assault 20 years ago when they were 16, and, the reasons they find to remand people who don't really need to be remanded, and where we've failed completely, is we don't have any kind of halfway house between being in bail and being in remand, I mean, some people are so dangerous they need to be in Barlinnie, but I honestly don't think it was 2,000 people in remand at the moment.
No.
It can't be as many as that. So you've got a lot of people in who are kind of repeat offenders because they're staying in the hostels in the town. They get kicked out during the day. They go and have a bottle of Buckfast and get drunk. Before you know it, they're lifted and they go to the hostel and they say, no, he's been causing trouble all week. We're not having him back. And so he goes to court, no fixed abode, straight to Barlinnie. It's crazy.
No, it's the money that's took to keep these people in.
Well, what was it, £27,000 a year or something?
I think it's 70. I don't know if that's for. I don't know if that's maybe different, but I'm £70,000. I'm sure for like LTPs. Right. I think it might be less for short.
Well, it's crazy, isn't it? Because you could halfway houses where people were tagged or whatever, and you
could buy them a house for that.
Exactly. Well, for that money, you could, and they found, that obviously that's a solution that the Home Office found in relation to asylum claims. So it never. I mean, if that could be done as a response to a particular problem, nobody's ever going to be able to explain to me why, when you've got COVID and the courts are now sitting, and it's obvious that the remand numbers are going to rise, why don't they buy a hotel and put people who are not dangerous on remand in the hotel on a tag where they can, and if they break that, then obviously you then consider, but we don't do that, so people are, so the judge is sitting or the sheriff usually is sitting for 5 minutes pondering it, and it's 50-50, and then they say, oh no, I mean, you've got a bail conviction, and that's the difference between lying in remand for 3 years, and going home. It's,
I think. See if you were like what you were talking about, like bracketed, like murder, attempt murder, like organised crime, whatever. Right? Yeah. That's no, like, if you explain to the public, they're no up for. Yeah. They're no up for. We're talking about here, which is the vast majority of the population of prison. Yeah. Like, you're talking about guys who are getting like remanded from and then you explain to them the money that it's costing. You say, this is what it's costing you guys, and you explain it in kind of layman's terms and go, do you think this person would be better like in the prison where he's going to come out worse because he's going to go in there, probably got addiction issues, blah blah, and then you're sending him out like a cannonball with nothing again? Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's one of the biggest scandals, that obviously go to Berlin to visit people, and you'll go on a Friday and there's 10 boys walking down the street with a poly bag, and they're going to head straight to the grocers at the bottom of the street and buy a bottle of Buckfast.
Seven of them are going back in a couple of months.
I mean, there's no accommodation for them or anything. They're just throwing them out. And I remember years ago there was a documentary about Courtroom Vale, and there was a girl went into Courtroom Vale and she got her act together and she was off with drugs and all that. And she was from Glasgow, Mary Hill, I think, possibly. And they just opened the door at Courtroom Vale and threw her out. I don't know if you remember it. And she had to go to the homeless in Stirling. And the next thing, she's in Stirling on her own in a single, bed sit on housing benefit. Doesn't know Andy. And of course, first thing she does is get into town. Do you know anybody that's got Valium or heroin or something?
I know.
And the TV crew went back, saw her about a week later, and she's way back, having taken months or maybe years to get her straight. She's banging, straight back on it within a week or 2 weeks. I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? You give that lassie a bit of help when she gets out. The chances are you're not having to spend whatever it is, £27,000.
Totally.
You keep her in jail. You pick her up at the prison, you take her back to Glasgow where her support is, and you get her on a programme. You can't just open the door and throw her out. But that's literally what they're doing, and
A good friend of mine's James Docherty. I don't know if you know James, but he's like absolutely amazing with trauma and stuff like that. And he said it was just a great way to put it. He said you wouldn't get like somebody who's got PTSD in the army and they're doing all right, they're asymptomatic, they're doing well.
Yeah.
You wouldn't rehouse them in the Helmand province where they were traumatised.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? But this is what we're doing to addicts. We're putting them back into the same place where the trauma is and all the crime is. Do you know what I mean? And it's actually absurd.
Do I was seeing a boy, it was a few years ago now, and he had just got out after 6 or 7 for attempted murder, and this was him back up for it. And he'd been in one of the hotels, so it was homeless population, put in one of the hotels, and he looks at his window and he sees a guy at a bus stop who has stabbed him or slashed him in the jail. So straight down there, stabbed him. And I remember it because it was Christmas Eve or something, so there was 1,000 people standing at a bus stop, so doing their Christmas shopping. And anyway, so it was in CCTV, so he's pleading guilty to it. And he wasn't 17, 18, he would probably be in his 30s by this point. And what have you got? What's the material you've got? He's out about a week, and here he is back in, and I'm saying, well, have you thought about what happens next? When you finish, how are we going to explain to the judge that it's not going to happen again? Because that's going to be her concern. Whatever sentence I give him, he's going to go out and he's going to do it again. And he just kind of looked at his well like that. He said, I could make something up. He said, I'm not going to do that. He said, I'll tell you what's happened again. I'll do the sentence and they'll let me out. And I've not got a friend in the world. I'll get put in one of those hostels, and inevitably something like this will happen again. That's
sad,
how hopeless it was. He hadn't even been sentenced. He was probably looking at about 5-6 years. And he said to the solicitor, can you do anything about my PlayStation? And I thought,
I know.
Fuck, this guy's 30. He's not got a friend in the world. The only thing he's got is the cops had taken it or something. Or maybe, he'd get dragged out the room, and obviously the hostel would put it in storage or something. And I thought, that's it. That's, at the age of 30, that's all he's got. And he's totally resigned to the fact, I'm going to be in jail for years, and then when I get out, I'm going to do something to get me back in, because, nobody's ever going to give me any help. It was tragic. And that conversation was probably 15 years ago. It's never left me. I just think, is that it?
I thought when I was in prison, I was obviously in prison a long time as well, Tommy. And when you see the kind of hopelessness, and listen, I was there. I ended up like it. You can't do 50. Well, we can. And there's a few guys I know that went through and done a life sentence or whatever, or done a big sentence and kind of never touched drugs or whatever. But when you start taking even painkillers and stuff like that, it's a slippery slope. And see if I didn't have the support network that I had, and the family that I had and stuff, I don't know where I would be. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about these issues. I'd probably be, and I had to do a lot of work on myself with acceptance and looking at it for different perceptions and trying to see it for different angles and stuff, which allowed me to be sane again, because you become kind of institutionalized. And that insanity is that's normal life now.
I see it, and unfortunately, some people get harmed in the process. There's undoubtedly people who get released and they just can't cope with it.
I know.
And so they do something, usually something completely senseless. And I always think, well, not always, but in some cases, I think he's really just done that to get back into jail. Because he's come out, he's not used to, having a partner and kids, and having to raise money and go to work. He's just not used to it, and he's just opted out. He's like, I can't cope with this. And I know you'll know as well, there are also, fortunately, not a huge number, but there are people who go into jail and never come out. They start slashing prisoners and slashing prison officers and taking people hostage and all that. And, they go in for something that might have got them 7 or 8 years and they end up there for 30 years because, they're just committing offences in the prison.
One of my I know Johnny Steele well, and Johnny's done amazing. He kind of become the person he is, and I talk about him a lot because that guy went through hell in there, he came for his dad was a criminal. He got brought up to be a criminal, and when he plays out his role and stuff, and then he becomes a kind of a person that people should be listening to more. Do you know what I mean? Because he's changed his life a bit. He's doing amazing. But I don't even know how he's still saying the stuff he went through. Do you know what I mean? But no, it's a good topic. But I'm going to take you on to another topic, a kind of controversial one that was just kind of. What did you think of the Supreme Court ruling the other day? Because to me it was common sense, but I know it's.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in that field, and I'd never really given the whole subject any thought. It seemed inevitable that they would make that interpretation of the legislation, and there's been a few situations now where the Scottish government hasn't listened to legal advice, and it's cost the taxpayer a lot of money. So that's my only concern. About the went to the Supreme Court on the independence referendum bill, and it was impossible to speak to a lawyer who thought they had any chance. Even their own lawyer, the Lord Advocate, had given them an opinion saying they never had any chance. So it's, when there are all these social issues with drugs and homelessness and all that, it's annoying that they're wasting money on completely hopeless legal cases, and it could, if they had accepted the interpretation that everybody else was putting on it, there wouldn't have been any need to go to the Supreme Court, So it's just another waste of resources.
It's not like it's like my position. It's like I don't have any if you want to be trans or I've got absolutely no problem with that. But it's such a small minority of the population that we're talking about that's caused this massive.
Do my wife has got a pal who's affected by it and is not in any way militant, just wants to live her life quietly, she works and she's really upset about it because it's become such a polarising issue that people are kind of personally attacking trans people, and that's really unfortunate as well.
Definitely.
I mean, it's an interpretation. The lawyers need to go away and think about it, but there's some real horrible stuff there, and this person doesn't deserve it, and I'm sure there are thousands of other people who are upset just at some of the vitriol that's been thrown about. I'm glad that the decision's been made, but everybody's got to move on about it and remember that there are real people out there with feelings who are not trying to upset anybody.
It was always there. It's like it was. You know what I mean? It's not like as if it was always there. To me, it was just a weird thing where it was so big, and you're only talking about a small minority who, if you take the extreme ones away, a lot of them were actually on the side of just get it in. We don't want we just let us live a life and you live your life. Do you know what I mean?
I don't think it's a complicated issue. I'm happy for everybody to live their life whatever way they want to do it, as long as they're not harming anybody. But, potentially it is harming anybody because we work with sex offenders. Some of them do horrific things and harm their own family, their own children, their own grandchildren. So for them, dressing up to obtain access to kids, for example, or
going to a court, like
exactly.
a jail, going to like a male going to a female prison and stuff.
It is not beyond. It is not beyond people who can be deceitful and manipulative and all that. So everybody with any common sense sees that. It's not controversial, and sadly, the debate about it has become really kind of polarised. Whereas if you put your head above the parapet and say anything about it on either side, then you're likely to be subject to kind of personal attack. So I've kind of tended to stay at it, mainly because I'm not an expert. I mean, I'm not sure I'm an expert in criminal justice, but I've been working in it for 40 years, so I know something about it. I don't know anything about the Equality Act, and I've no interest really in getting involved in it.
No, I think that's fair, and it is just, that's kind of my point as an autonomy on it. It's like it's horrible, and I think the way the world is now, it's like you've got this extreme left and extreme right, and if you're in the middle, or you're trying to say, look, I get what you're saying, like with the immigration thing, I understand where people. I mean, I totally understand where people are coming from for that. But I'm still a kind of social. I still believe in a good social welfare system where we should be pumping a lot more money into helping like the impoverished people. And I think even people that think they're right wing don't understand that that's actually what they're voting for is privatising. It's hidden under the agenda. It's hidden. Well, for me, it's hidden under the fact that they're doing this immigration, and people are voting for privatising all these stuff. And you're like, I don't even think they know what they're doing. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, but they do need to talk about it, if Definitely. They just try, if people are, whatever the subject is, if the people are concerned about the subject and the politicians are just refusing to talk about it because it's too hot, then you get extreme positions, don't you? People say, well, they're not prepared to do anything about it, so we'll go in that direction. And unfortunately, that can also lead to people being hurt or, abused, or their life being made difficult. I mean, I think probably a high percentage of the population agree on most things, and there are people on the fringes, and I think there might be some evidence of a kind of disconnect where the guy in the street or the women in the street are saying nobody's talking about this, the politicians are just refusing to talk about it, so we'll need to find somebody who does talk about it. And I think throughout Europe that's had some unfortunate consequences.
No, definitely. And but I think it's just one of these things where you've got, I'll speak to some of my pals and they're like, no, I'm right wing, and you trying to explain to them what right wing is. They're like, do you know what it is? And I know, but I believe in. I said, but do you believe? Are you working class? Aye. Do you believe we're getting like fucked over by the billionaires? Aye. I went, well, see all the rest of it. We don't need the rest. That, so if we can agree on that, we can come together at least and try and.
I've never thought it's that helpful as a term, because people will have different views on different issues, and putting people in a box is not going to really encourage sensible debate, because if you just say, I regard you as right wing, so I'm refusing to talk to you, and that might be justified in some extreme circumstances, but not in every circumstance. It'd be as well to sit everybody in and have a talk about it and try and persuade them, rather than banning them from speaking because you don't agree with what they're likely to say.
No, I like, see the Tommy Robinson case. I don't agree with Tommy Robinson, like with his politics. I don't agree with him but what they're doing to him in the prison, the solitary confinement and all that, I don't agree with that. So I wrote a tweet and I got a lot of kind of, and I'm like, I know I've seen what this does to people. I've seen the psychosis and all this kind of stuff.
I mean, I actually agree with imprisoning him in as a start. I think the sentence is grossly excessive, but I'm not sure there was an understanding really of what he did. I mean, getting a finding against you, so basically the court has intervened to say, we don't think you told the truth when you said these things about this kid. Now, when you get that order from the court, it's not really that much good to you if the person who said it last year can go and say it again, because, that's what's the upsetting thing. So if there's an order where they've said to him, this has been proved to be false, you're not allowed to say it. And, you know, he went ahead and said it. Now, that creates a whole lot of problems. It creates a problem in that particular case. But if you're not punished for doing it, nobody's ever going to respect any order of the court again. And an order at that time is not going to be worth the paper that it's written on. So I completely understand. He wasn't jailed for the video. He was jailed because he was told not to repeat the defamatory statement in relation to the boy concerned. And he knew what he was doing, you know. Now, as to the sentence, to me, it seems excessive. And the way, obviously, it creates problems in the prison because he was likely to be a target. So it might be the case, it might well be the case that the punishment for him is excessive in relation to what he did. But I completely understand if the court tells you for good reason not to do something and you give them the V sign and just go ahead and do it. And it's not the first time he's done it. You know,
I know.
He get done for contempt for filming people coming and going for court. And so, you know, there's an I think, and it's not just in this issue, in a lot of legal issues. And one of the reasons I kind of get involved in social media on legal issues is to try and correct some of the inaccuracies, because in his case, it's become, you know, he get the jail for making a video. You know, he didn't get the jail for making a video. You know, that's the truth of it. And but sadly, if people just repeat the inaccurate statement on social media, then quickly that becomes the story, and people really forget what the facts of the case are.
I think that's the problem, isn't it? It's like you've got so much now, and you've got even like, so you've got these like CIA agents and stuff coming out and talking about like 9/11 was an inside job, and it's causes a lot of confusion. Like people are confused; they don't really know what to believe. So you're taking on part of what you believe, and then somebody's reaffirming that to you. So that all of a sudden it's the truth, and then before you know it, it builds up, as you say, and then before you know it, it's.
I mean, and it's actually a level worse than that, because just by correcting people in relation to what the law is, I've been attacked just for that, you know. And all I'm saying is, well, I'm sorry, but that's not right. Here's the factual position, and you know, Scotland's kind of polarised between the nationalists and the non-nationalists, and you know, if I've been attacked by both sides, you know, but just be saying, well, actually, what you're saying about that is incorrect. And you know, one day you're an SNP apologist, and the next minute you're a Quisling because you're supporting the union. And all I'm doing is, I even, you know, get terrible abuse because somebody was asking whether a woman could be convicted of rape. It was around about the time of the Isla Bryson case. And I quoted word for word the section of the Sexual Offences Act 2009, and I get terrible abuse for it. Somebody accused me of a lack of humanity. And I've said, all I'm doing is saying, because there's a reference to an artificially constructed penis, and I was saying, well, you know, you can rape somebody with an artificially constructed penis. So if you think that a woman can have an artificially constructed penis, then the answer is, well, then a woman could, in law, be convicted of rape. And I was being called a transphobe, and I was lacking humanity. And as I said, all I did was quote the section. So listen, I'm prepared to put up with it. It is unpleasant at times, and I try to avoid offending people, but I feel a strange responsibility when I read something about Scottish criminal justice which is inaccurate to correct it.
No, we need more of it, Tommy. We need more people to come out and say, because there is so much misinformation, disinformation, and it's trying to find the kind of where you stand, and a lot of people are just looking for them to reaffirm what their beliefs are. Do you know what I mean? So,
but you know, I don't get an awful lot of that, but it is upsetting for my daughters, you know. So, and people will say to me at work, well, why do you do this? You know, why you get involved in it? Why you go on Twitter talking about, you know, the Operation Branch Forum or something like that, you know, and because they see that I get abuse from it. And so other lawyers who might be smarter than me or might have an interesting opinion on it, they're just saying, I'm not going near it because I see the abuse that you've had in the past, and, you know. And,
that's character, but for you, Tommy.
Well, I mean, I quite enjoy it, and I've got an interest in it. But you can understand why people like me who would have as valid opinions as me just say that Twitter and social media is not for me if I'm going to get personal abuse on the back of it. So I'm just staying out of it. And as a result, you get less really informed opinions, and you get a lot of crazies, just talking rubbish and abusing people who correct them.
No, it's like, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to go into my politics, right? I believe I'm doing the conspiracy road, but I'll sit in my partner. She's she's totally doesn't like any of this stuff, right? She's just worried about me and her 2 kids, right? And I'll go, Mossad agents saying this, and then she'll go, Sean, just leave me in my wee bubble. I don't care, what she's. And I think you've got to respect people that are like that as well. But I like a debate. But obviously, you want healthy debate. You don't want everything turning to hatred. Do you know what I mean? It's
I'm maybe exaggerating. Most of it is decent. There's maybe been half a dozen times when I've really taken a lot of stick, and I just say, right, all right, I'm now getting stick. I'm not going back and reading that. But I know my daughters read it, and then my wife will say, Rachel was saying that she saw somebody, abusing you on Twitter or something, and I'm just going to delete it, because I can't have her been upset or my other daughter. She doesn't really take any interest in it at all, but I know that my younger daughter will look at it, and if somebody's giving me personal abuse, or what I'm really worried about is my wife, who doesn't take a back step for anybody's going to get involved in it. That's what I'm really worried about. She's going to say, who's that bastard? Giving these things. So, I delete it before she sees it, because I don't want to be going to Court and Vale visiting her.
But I think it's just because I follow you on Twitter, and you break stuff down a lot, and it's, you put it into layman's terms for people.
That's
and
what I'm trying to do.
I don't see where the anything is. I mean, even if you did have an opinion, why are you not allowed to? Like, do you know what I mean? Is it because what you're doing is then essentially bracketing yourself as a person who is maybe above getting that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Whereas you're saying, look, I'm just a person, let's say, as everybody else, and I'm going to try and explain.
Well, I mean, I've got to be honest. I like that. I like when people say to me, you can explain things in quite a kind of common sense way in which that's what I always say, non-lawyers, there's people like us, lawyers, who are a bit weird, most of them, including me, because we're kind of straight line. We want to remember, great, go to a lawyer's quiz night, everybody remembers everything about movies and records and books and everything, but very few of them are creative. They're not painting pictures or making music or anything, most of them, but we're great at reading information and remembering it. So it's but I don't want to get involved. I thought at one point I might be quite interested in writing kind of academic stuff. I've no interest in doing it. There are people who are a million times better than me. If I'm helping people who don't have law degrees to understand things better, then I'm happy with that, and I think I can do that. And that's what I do a bit on LinkedIn, and basically I try and pick something that's in the news and just kind of break it down and explain it. And I love it because, I see a lot of lawyers and we talk about the same things. It's great when somebody who's not a lawyer says, I read that and I didn't really understand it, and now I do understand it. Here's my opinion on it and all that. That's kind of what you say, breaking it down, where people say, oh, that subject's too heavy. I'm never going to be able to get into that. If you can get people over that and then they say, I get it. We can have a talk about it. That's great.
No, it's a game changer. I mean, there should be more people doing it, and there should be more. It's and I understand people want to stay in their bubble. In some cases, maybe pull your way into the line, obviously the line. And I've been dragged to the ringer, so I don't think anybody could write any worse about me. Do you know what I mean? At times, but it doesn't really bother me. But again, it's it can affect you. Well, it certainly used to affect people. Not as much now. I think people just get used to it in the family, but it is a lot of people I've had on here on the podcast, and that is a fear that they have, is that kind of trolling and whatever. Do you know what I mean? And there's people out there with fake accounts, and they start kind of
I've
just
seen
it's no nice. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, I've only ever had it for about 5 hours. You know, nobody's ever really, you know, come at me hard. You know, and that's the nature of social media, isn't it? You know, there's a hot issue and everybody's got something to say about it. By 5 o'clock, they moved on to something else and they've forgotten all about it. So it's never really been anything that's caused me a drastic problem. There's been a few times when it's been a bit unpleasant, and I've just thought it's no fair to my family because they'll get more. I won't even read it once I realise the way it's going. Whereas I know that my younger daughter will. So sometimes I just, you know, opt to take a couple of days off.
I see it as like a big playground, like Twitter. Twitter's the worst, but and sometimes I'll go and I'll just have a go at Andrew Tate or whatever, like just somebody that I don't like, right? But I see it as a kind of big playground, and there's bullies on it. There's influential people on it that shouldn't be influential. You've got big people with big characters. It's like, it reminds me of the playground. You know what I mean? And you try and find your where you are, but it's no, it's I think it's amazing what you do, Tommy. But that's my opinion. But
it's changed it, you know, because 15 years ago, if I had a opinion about a particular legal issue, I would only really have access to lawyers, and I would need to sit down and write it and then send it to the Scots Law Times or one of the paper versions of the law reports or the journals. Now, that process is probably taking 2 weeks, you know, and by the time it actually gets published, nobody's interested in it any longer because it's too long. Whereas now I can get up in the morning and there's something in the Scotsman about a legal issue and I can write something about it, you know, instantly and put it on LinkedIn or Twitter or something. So, you know, it's like a combination of having the interest, but also social media just makes it accessible and you just put it out there and the people are not interested, fair enough, you know.
No, I honestly, I think your take on it's really good, and I'd love to end it. It's Disney follow Tommy. I think they should. But I'm going to take you on to like the Criminal Case Reviews Commission, right? Yeah. So this is my stance here. I don't see them as fit for purpose. Yeah. I don't know what's your views on that.
I'm going to be honest. I've never really had any dealings with them. You know, I've never had to remit a case to them. My only involvement with them really is sometimes when a convicted person makes an application, they will sometimes come to the QC or KC who represented him and say, look, he thinks this didn't get done, or, you know, that this factor was not taken into account. What do you think about it? So really my involvement with them has been as a witness. I know people say that, and obviously the English one has come into under huge criticism, particularly in relation to the Malkinson case. Right. So it's a difficult function that they've got, but I don't have any real insight as to how they perform it.
No, it's like, obviously, see, I look at their stats and stuff like that, and their stats are pretty bad. Do you know what I mean? Obviously, I had my own experience with the commission, and it wasn't good. But again, it's like, I suppose the question is can we afford a good legal system now? Can Scotland afford a good legal system that's got?
I mean, I'm not abducting the question. I genuinely don't know how they work really, and I don't know any of the people who are involved in it. But the real problem is the lack of funding for the solicitors who do the work.
That's what I was saying.
To me, that's a huge problem, because what we've got is an aging population. I mean, when I was coming up, the way it used to work really is you would have a kind of senior partner, as we did, who was, you know, I suppose he would be 15, 20 years ahead of me in the profession, who wouldn't do that much, you know. They would kind of pick their cases, and it would be the young ones that would be running about doing all the trials at the district court and the sheriff court and all that. And, you know, the older ones would gradually kind of ease out of the hard graft and, you know, take a more kind of leisurely approach to it. Can't do that any longer. You know, the guys who are now kind of my age, you know, a bit younger, kind of mid-50s to their 60s, they're working harder now than they were when they were 25.
I know.
Because they can't afford any assistance, you know, and part of the problem or really the main problem is, firstly, they haven't increased the legal aid fees since about 1999 or something crazy. But worse than that, Scottish government, I mean, the SNP is really in favour of kind of big government. So if you look at the number of government jobs, which have been created since 2007, it's astronomical. And a lot of those jobs are lawyers. So, a guy who's got an office, and we had an office in Royston and Paul and Drumchapel and Govan and all that. So you're attracting young solicitors who are just coming out of university. They would be getting paid, maybe to work in Govan, they might be getting paid 25 grand. Whereas if they go and work for the Scottish government, they're getting 45 grand, Or if they go into fiscal service in a place where they're struggling to get staff, they might get 55, So people will do their traineeship. You've got to do 2 years as a trainee solicitor. So they'll do that at, an office in Govan or Drumchapel or Pollock. But then it gets to the end, and if they're offered a job, they're trying to go on the housing ladder or whatever, and they say, how much can you give me? Well, I can probably give you 30. And their pals are working for the Scottish. They don't even go to their work. They can work from home for 45 or 50 grand with, 8 weeks holiday and sick leave and all of that, So it's draining the profession, and people don't see it any longer as a viable option, really. That is the problem. So the young ones are not getting involved in it. The older ones are just having to do all the work themselves, which obviously affects the quality. Because they're just spinning, and I'm not criticising them. In fact, I'm complimenting them, because most
sensible 20 cases not in their caseload that way.
You wouldn't believe it, and they just the system just makes changes without any consultation, which affects them. That recently somebody'd phoned me for advice about something, and they'd introduced a new kind of procedure at the sheriff court, another hearing, another pre-trial hearing, and I think, how are we covering this? We're already trying to do the jails, do the district, and now we've got to drop everything at half two and go and do a hearing. We're not even getting paid for it. What other profession would they say, well, here's another thing that you need to do. What's the benefit? Of nothing. It's still part of the fee that you got in 1999. It hasn't increased, So, the young ones are refusing to get involved in it. And the older ones are just running down the clock until, they've got enough money to retire, and nobody's coming in to replace them. So what you'll get is eventually it'll be a few kind of super firms, who,
just deal with
everything. And that's, I think, what the Scottish government want. They don't want.
Would that be good or bad, Tommy?
Well, it would be bad, I think, because, the ideal situation is you've got somebody who's got the time and the resources to devote a lot of research into every case. And probably you're getting that for kind of sole practitioners, because they've got a interest in you coming back, frankly, So they want to do a great job because there's a big market out there. And, if you've got another case in 2 years, they want you to be coming back. Maybe in the bigger firms, where you might be seeing, if you, same idea in the kind of medical profession, you go to the GPs, it's kind of these medical centres where 40 years ago you would have a doctor, now you just see whoever you get, So I suppose maybe if it moves to a big firm model, then there's less personal contact. And I mean, I liked being a solicitor. I wanted to do the big trials, and I wasn't going to get a chance to do that. But I liked the contact with the clients, and the fact that somebody would come to you, you'd acted for 15 years, and bring their kid in or something and say, look, he's getting terrible trouble. I told him there was only one lawyer to come to, and all that. I mean, I like building that kind of
contact. What I say when I was obviously my pal says, tell Tom I was asking for him.
But it's honestly, I left the solicitor's profession in 1999. It's 200% worse than it was then. I mean, I never left because it was bad. I left because I wanted to do trials in the High Court, but I could see the way it was going, and it wasn't difficult to leave, because I was thinking they're never going to get. I mean, are the government ever going to give solicitors a 25% rise when they can only give the nurses 5% or the binman 5%? The public would, because they don't understand, the money hasn't gone up since, for 26 years, So that is the problem. If you just press and press and press, the sad thing is there isn't enough hours in the day for the solicitors really to devote a lot of time, and in the High Court cases, quite a lot of the time they're really just a post box. They're just kind of sending you the stuff and saying, I've not really got time to read it. Can you read it and tell me what I need to do? And I'm happy to do that, but the reality is the Legal Aid Board are paying in a High Court case. In a murder, you would have 3 lawyers. You would have a solicitor and junior counsel and senior counsel, and obviously when the stakes are so high, you would be wanting everybody to be chipping in, and sadly a lot of the time the solicitors just don't have the time to do it, so really all they're doing is getting the papers from the prosecution and passing them to us, and I would never criticise them for it. Actually, because I spend so much time preparing it in fact doesn't really make any difference, because even if they had done the work, I would do it all over again just to make sure that everything was covered. But I'm not sure, I just couldn't be certain that everybody does that. So it might be that things are missed.
I think, obviously, a subject close to my heart, Tommy, is miscarriage of justices, and I think what you're going to end up with is probably more miscarriage of justices if that goes on. And
I think I've always thought that Scotland's really, really weak on identification evidence, and I've written a few things about that, and it's going to get much, much worse, because in every country in the world, the majority of miscarriages of justice are generally based on mistaken witness testimony, and in that group, quite a large proportion is mistaken identification, and you don't need to think too hard to come up with examples, and it's really, really it's a really difficult subject if you don't handle it correctly, because if somebody comes across to the jury as really decent and respectable and doing their best to give honest evidence, you can be doing all that in an identification and still get it wrong. If somebody comes in and they're deliberately telling lies to try and get somebody done because they don't like him or they're falling out with him or something, usually with cross-examination, to some extent, that can be detected, where the jury are thinking, well, he seems to hate this guy, so maybe he would have a motive for misrepresenting the evidence. You can't do it with identification evidence. You get people who are completely honest, they've never been convicted of an offence in their life, and they say, I'm telling you 100% it was him, and it isn't. It's there are cases where it's proved that it wasn't him, but and the jury are sitting thinking, well, she seems like a really nice woman, and she goes to her work and works in a shop, and why should she be getting robbed? When she's a decent woman, and they're thinking, well, she wouldn't say that if it wasn't him, because
when it's human nature just to get things wrong.
You just get it wrong, and everybody knows that. It's not that I'm making it up. You could go to any country in the world, and if they've had their miscarriages of justice based on wrongful identification. And in England, the response to it was they had the Devlin Committee, and they brought in PACE, which regulated identification parades and the showing of photographs and all that. And, put a ton of work into it. It's only down the road, if you're staying in Dumfries, the English system is literally 15 minutes down the road. And we had a look at it and just thought, everything's all right. Everything's all right. We don't need any of that, because in Scotland, nobody gets it wrong. Magically, once you cross the border, that people just don't make, there's no evidence of many, many miscarriages based on this. So we don't need the rules, And they brought in Lord Advocate's guidelines as to the way in which showing of photographs and ID parades should be conducted. And then the police just ignored the guidelines. And when we went to the appeal court and said this, and they said, well, they're just guidelines. They're no enforceable. They're not enforceable. So what's the point in having them? What's the point in having them? The police can just ignore them. And, and then you get to the stage where the fiscals read these cases and think, well, don't even bother having any ID parades. The rules say that we should. But, we'll not bother. We'll just get the police to show the photographs, and then we'll need evidence. You've got the stage where in Scotland, if a witness is shown 12 mugshots and picks somebody out and then comes to the trial and says, I've thought about it and that was not the person who was involved, that case still goes to the jury.
I know.
It still goes to the jury because the witness picked the person in the first place. I mean, it's madness. And, you know, I've written about it. I've given examples from other countries. I've given examples for this country. You know, there's, you know, but the time when they did the Bryden report, which was the response to the Devlin report, there was about 6 miscarriages of justice in Scotland based on identification evidence, which is referred to in the report. I mean, it's only a small country. We've only got 5 million people. And there were 6 identifiable examples, one of which I looked into, and it was a robbery in a bank up at Maryhill. And the guy came out after the robbery. He got identified by 3 people, and he had nothing to do with it. 3 people identified him, he got convicted, and then a guy who was going round robbing various places in Glasgow got caught and did a deal with the cops, and he said, I did the one up in Maryhill, and they're thinking, we've got a guy in Berlin for that. And they went back and did the forensic, and the guy's fingerprints were on the in the bank, and so they had to quash the conviction. They knew about that. They knew that this guy had served a sentence for something that he didn't do, and the response was, well, there isn't that many. There isn't that many, so why do we need to do anything? I mean, the fact that there's one, I would have thought, even if you get one, you need to do something, don't you?
I remember, see, Tony Blair, when he was a KC or a QC at the time, he said he would rather have like 10 innocent people in jail than one guilty guy outside. And if that's the way you're looking at things, look, we all know that the system is there to protect everybody, and if people think that's shaky, or people think that's like that, we know that they want to protect the system, but do you think that the public are sheltered to how much they want to protect that system?
I don't. It's like, you know, I don't know how many stomach cancer experts there is in Scotland, but if I had stomach cancer, I would find it. You know, it's the same way the legal system, isn't it? You know, people don't have a very keen interest in what's going on in trials in Scotland until it's them who are on trial or their kids on trial. And I tell you, they would be shocked if they found out, you know, how little evidence is needed in Scotland before you get convicted. And you know, the Lord Advocate's reference from last year, which has really slipped under the radar because, you know, it was mainly, the first one was about distress as evidence, and there was quite a lot of debate about that. But the second one, the position essentially is the example I gave with the woman's working in the petrol station, for example, and somebody comes in and robs it. The law in Scotland is now, if a customer comes in after the robbery and sees the woman and she's shaking and says, what happened? And she says, oh, Sean Toll just came in and robbed me. The fact that she mentions Sean Toll to the customer is now corroboration.
Is it?
It's corroboration. So you could go to the Buchanan galleries and speak to 1,000 people. You couldn't get one who would agree that that's a second source of evidence. It plainly is not a second source of evidence. And, you know, against the background where they can break all the rules, the police can break all the rules in relation to parades and the showing of photographs, and the appeal court just wave it through. How many more miscarriages of justice are there going to be if a witness can, you know, and people get it wrong?
No, of course, it's not like it's a human system. It's like it's no, but I think they want it to be infallible in the way that it's no to present. I get it. I get you want to present to your society that, look, we don't get things wrong. This is a stern, but it is a human, and there's errors get made, and especially when you're talking. I mean, I don't know if it was Darren Brown. He done an amazing kind of program about it when guys ran in, robbed a bank. So they were all, it was actors. You see the witness statements. It was like he had a blue t-shirt on, nothing of it. They were all, it was so all over the place.
It's just human nature, isn't it?
I know.
And you know, it's not like the lawyers are making this up. You know, you can go to the books and find umpteen examples where people have been convicted of things that they didn't do. I mean, look at just last year, the guy Malkinson, who was released, unbelievable. But convicted on the basis of identification evidence, which was undoubtedly wrong. And the other thing that people don't appreciate is in England, the judge can make an assessment of the identification evidence and essentially stop the trial. So, once the basis in which the witness identifies the accused is explored, the judge can say, well, I don't think that would give a safe basis for a conviction because it was a stranger and it was dark. And the judges in Scotland don't have that power. I mean, if somebody, who had 5% eyesight come into a witness box in Scotland and said, I was 200 yards away, but I'm telling you, it was that guy who did it. That is evidence that goes to the jury in Scotland. The judge does not have the power to say, well, that's so shaky, it would be unsafe. In fact, in Scotland, they brought in a provision specifically to stop the judges upholding no case to answer submissions on the basis of the quality of the evidence. They're not allowed to do it.
Well, I know. And then see when you take that on the back of like the principle of like something like finality and certainty, and obviously that was close to me as well. But the finality and certainty thing is a lot of guys are like, if you're a first offender, you don't know the law, you don't know what, so you're putting all your trust in a lawyer, and if they make a mistake because they've got a caseload of 30 people and they can't remember this or and they make a mistake, it's like, no, if you find that and you had the opportunity to do that at your original trial, they're now saying it's no, you can't rerun that.
I mean, everything you say is correct. But even if the lawyers are perfect, what do you do when you've got 3 witnesses who identify somebody and they're all wrong? If you go to the appeal court, they're just going to say, well, the jury assessed all that and, they took them to be credible. You're really dependent on being able to prove that you're innocent, which is not the constitutional position. I mean, everybody understands that the accused doesn't have to prove anything, that the Crown... But the minute somebody IDs you, it's different. You go to the appeal court and you just say, well, look at the state of this identification evidence. How could any reasonable jury possibly convict on the basis of that? I think since the provision came in, I think there's been one appeal successful on the no reasonable jury, and it was a guy who'd identified 3 different people for the same crime. It was a miracle how it had even got to the jury and what the jury were thinking of convicting him, nobody knows, But the reality is, if the ID evidence is just rubbish and everybody can see it's rubbish, if the jury swallow it, the appeal court's not going to, and neither, I think...
Because it's quite a big... Sorry for butting in, Tommy, but it's quite a big... I don't think the public realise how much the judges and that will take on board, like, a jury's opinion is sacred.
Yep.
Like, that's sacred, and we're no here to hang a jury's opinion.
Exactly. That's the basis in which the entire system works. And I understand it, but, I think in particular in relation to identification evidence, when there's strong material to support that good, honest people make mistakes, you just need to be careful. It's not enough to say, the solution in Scotland is you say to the jury, you need to be careful with this because, people have made mistakes. And what they always say, people have made mistakes in the past. Now, that's not to say that anybody's made a mistake in this case, which I always think levels it. So if they hate the accused, and they like the 55-year-old woman that works in the petrol station, they're nodding along like, oh, aye. Mr. Ross has just spoke to us about identification evidence and miscarriages of justice and Paddy Meehan and all this. And then the judge just wipes it out and says, well, that doesn't mean there's a mistake. I'm not saying there definitely is a mistake. What I'm saying is the case has got to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. And how can it be the case when she picked him out for photographs but never picked him out at the parade, or there wasn't a parade and he's the only person in the court sitting? I had an appeal actually, and it was an Asian guy who was charged with a robbery. And we had been asking about a parade. They never had a parade, so they then tried to do a doc ID, and I objected to it. And he was he was the only Asian guy in the court. So the witnesses had given a description of 50-year-old Asian guy come in, and we thought he was into buy fags, and he pulled out a knife or a gun or something. It's a kind of local newspaper shop. I'm thinking, how can this possibly? They put him in the centre of the court. They built a dock to put him in. He's got 2 security guards either side of him, and he's the only Asian guy in the court. And the first time the witnesses are asked to identify him, they said, "Do you see him?" And they're thinking, I'm guessing it might be the only Asian guy in the entire court, given that that's what I said at the time. And I object to it. It goes to the appeal court, and they said, "Nah, well, it was a very They actually complimented me. They said, "No, I mean, you made a really strong speech to the jury about it," and then the jury rejected it. So hard lines, mate.
I think what that's the problem, is the kind of the jury's perfect, or like they can't get it wrong or whatever. Because I know when I was researching you with the majority verdict and that, you're no like keen on that.
No.
And I was found guilty on a majority verdict, and it was like you don't know what the majority was, but you do tend to go like, well, like, obviously I'm not asking you to hang in my case or anything, but I'm just saying, like, if I was allowed to get the forensic evidence in, could that have swayed one more person that could have made you, do you know what I mean?
I mean, that's the another weakness. I mean, I see the point in moving to a 2-verdict system. Logically, it makes sense to me. But I've always thought the question for the jury is, has the charge been proved beyond reasonable doubt? There's only 2 answers to that, which is yes or no. So I always thought the sensible solution the jury would either find the charge proven or not proven, and that would be recorded by the court as guilty or not guilty. So you don't involve the jury in guilt or innocence or any of that. You just say to them, which is actually their function, Crown have got to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. If you think they've done that, then you find the charge proven. And if you find that they haven't done it, you find it not proven. My suspicion is they don't want to do that because they think there'll be less convictions. That's what I think. But the weakness, because we had 3 verdicts, we are the only country in the world, I believe, where you can get convicted on a simple majority. So you can go to trial in Scotland for murder and get convicted 8-7. Now, and they don't even tell you. They don't ask the jury what the majority is. So you could go to prison and a majority verdict, and you don't know if it's 14-1 or 8-7. That doesn't make any sense to me. I think if the jury is a body and 7 of them think that you're not guilty or the charge has been not proven, to me that's a reasonable doubt. If that's not a reasonable doubt, I don't know what it is, So in England, it's got to be, they ask for a unanimous verdict, but they'll take a 10-2. That's more or less the figure that's been kind of adopted in most of the common law countries. And that's what we should have, if we're moving to a 2-verdict. And I think it's moved about a bit. I think when we do move to 2 verdicts, I think they'll need 10 for a conviction, which is much better than the current system.
You think, like, obviously somebody that got done with a majority verdict, it does really affect how you think. You want to know how many people and stuff like that. Do you think it will move to that too, or do you think no?
No, I mean, I think it's done to protect the jury, really. I think there's a kind of, I don't know, people might work it, or criminals might make some inference from the fact that a certain number of jurors voted for them or against them. But, listen, I'm in favour of the jury system. There's a lot of areas in which it could be improved. We tend to work on the basis we don't really want to know what the jury do, because if we did, we might need to wonder whether we need to find an alternative, So it's shrouded in mystery. Nobody's allowed to talk to them. In England, they've got a much more mature approach where they've permitted Cheryl Thomas, who's a professor at UCL in London, and she's got access, I think, to maybe 10,000 jurors, which is strictly voluntary. They're given, as I understand it, they're given a card when they leave with a free phone number, and they just say you're under no obligation, and nobody will ever ask you your name or anything like that. But if you want to phone and, answer some questions, I don't know why we can't do it. The Contempt of Court Act, is a UK statute, so it applies equally in Scotland and England. Never understood why they can do this kind of research in England, and we've never done it. I mean, we got ourselves involved in an incredible situation where they were talking about having juryless trials.
We're going to come on to
and
that.
they were using support for it. In a fake jury example where they got a bunch of students and volunteers. Now, everybody in that knows there isn't a real victim. There isn't a real accused who's going to jail. I mean, the whole thing is interesting in an academic sense. It's no basis whatsoever for making changes to the way people live, I mean...
I actually was in favour of that till you just said that.
Aye.
Like, till you just put it that way.
Aye.
Like, I would have went, I know that's a good way to do it, but there is no substance behind it.
Well, that's what makes the job difficult for the jury, isn't it? Especially in kind of single complainer rape cases, where in quite a lot of them, both parties come across as perfectly decent, honest people, and the jury are just thinking, well, I don't know who to believe here, so I can't really convict the guy because it's kind of 50-50, and they've got all that. They're thinking, oh God, this woman's going to be really upset, if she's come to court and given evidence and it's not proven. But at the same time, that boy seems like a decent boy, and if we convict him, he's going to jail for 6 years, and that'll be he's at university or he's working, and all that's going to go. That's the reality of being a juror, and you don't have any of that if it's just a fake, And I mean the whole trial that the jury looked at, the fake jury looked at, lasted an hour. An hour. And that's for the speeches, the charge, the evidence.
Some trials are 12 weeks.
I did a trial that lasted 6 months. And they're making, people are now saying, there's some, people who regularly contribute to news items in relation to this kind of issue will say, well, there's substantial evidence that juries think this or think that. They're not talking about juries, they're talking about pretend juries, which is a different concept altogether. I mean, it's like, going to Joe Pesci where you're talking about making changes to how people are cross-examined, and you say, well, we're going to go and consult Joe Pesci because, you're my cousin Vinny, I mean, if you suggested that to anybody, they would lock you up, that we're going to speak to people who pretend to be lawyers to see what legal changes would be. But Scotland was going to make legal changes on the basis of people who were pretending to be jurors. It's insane. And they were getting 50 quid as well. They were getting 50 quid for their expenses, which we never found out for a while. So fortunately, there's been a bit of a retreat from that. I mean, you can see these things frustrate me, and there's not really an awful lot of people talking about them, so I'm going to keep talking about them.
No, we need it. We need it. Honestly, it's like And I mean, obviously, the only other person I've had on like KC wise was Chris Daw, and he did say like, I says, what's the solution? And he says, I'd rip the whole thing up and start again. Do you know what I mean? And I mean, I'm not saying that that's how Scotland is, but it's sometimes when you look at some of this, they make absurd decisions where you're like, what is? And I think it is just. You could correct me if I'm wrong, Tommy, but I would say it's to protect their conviction rates.
Aye. I mean, that's. I don't think we've got a terrible system. Most trials I'm involved in, I'm perfectly happy with the way the trial's been conducted. Even when I lose, and obviously at this level, you're going to lose more than you win, So I'm not saying rip up the whole system. What I'm saying is, don't be influenced by conviction rates. It's perfectly understandable why there's a lower conviction rate, for example, in single complainer rape cases where you've only got one witness. I'm doing murder trials where they've got 10 eyewitnesses, DNA, fingerprints, CCTV. It's unsurprising if you're getting more convictions in those cases than you're getting in single complainer rape cases where both the complainer and the accused are going to come across when they're sober as quite decent, honest people, So I don't think we should be, and unfortunately, in the last few years, I think the way the law has gone has been influenced by that there's now a public perception that it's almost impossible to get a conviction in a rape case. If that was true, then it would be a terrible situation for the victims. But I think they're kind of lessening the quality, the standards which are expected of evidence in the hope that the conviction rate will rise. And sadly, that's going to result in innocent people going to the jail.
Right. No, listen, I couldn't put it any better. Like, and it's made me rethink the way that you're looking at things, and because academic, it's totally different. But so see, like we're just kind of coming up to near the end of the podcast, Tommy. Where do you see? I don't even know if you can kind of comment, but what do you think of the Luke Mitchell case? Because that's a case, like, obviously it was kind of, I think it's kind of similar to Malkinson.
It's an incredibly interesting case. I can understand why he got convicted. I can understand that. But it's a fascinating case because there's so many aspects to it. And I've had a look at the appeals. But, you know, it's just another example where eventually the response of the appeal court is there enough evidence? Are there 2 or 3 sources of evidence? And if there was, then it's up to the jury what they make of it, you know.
Right.
And that is really, really difficult to change. I mean, I don't think Scotland's unique in this. I think if you look at Malkinson, I'd never heard of the Malkinson case.
No,
And when I heard about
right.
it, I thought, how is this possible in 2025 that the victims get somebody else's DNA? And it's never disclosed to anybody, you know. And the guy, how long did he serve in prison? I mean,
It was a long time. I think it was maybe
it's just
11.
incredible.
Yeah, 11.
So I mean, we're no unique. These things definitely happen in England. I don't have much of an insight as to other countries, but I'm certain, given that America and Australia and Ireland and more or less have the same system as the English system, they must happen there as well. So it's a problem. I just think we could do better. And I think there is a kind of sanctity of conviction. You know, the minute the jury has made a decision, that's it, you know. And really, it's a massive uphill struggle for anybody in Scotland to have any conviction reversed. And, you know,
I know.
You look at cases and think, how did he get convicted? You know, the Willie Gage case, you know, you look at Willie Gage's case. I don't know him. I've never spoken to him. I've never spoken to any of the lawyers. And the police take a eyewitness into a room where they've dressed a mannequin in clothing and say, is that I mean, what's the witness thinking? You know, that the cop shop's just full of rooms with mannequins dressed, you know. You're obviously thinking, well, they must think this is the clothing that the person's wearing. And that becomes evidence that forms the basis for a conviction and murder. I mean, I'm not sure that, honestly, I'm not sure that could happen anywhere else in the world.
No.
That would be viewed as acceptable evidence, you know.
I know. And even, I mean, the big case that you would talk about if you're talking about miscarriage is obviously the Joe Steele case and the TC case.
Incredible.
But I mean, how that even happened and occurred, it's bizarre. Like when you actually look at the evidence and you're like, how? Do you know what I mean? But again, it is when there's a massive public outcry and
that's exactly what I was thinking. I get the how. I've been there, and you know, terrible crimes where everybody just hates the crime and hates the guy that's in the dock, and they can't even make the separation. You know, this is so bad that somebody's got to go to jail for it. And at the moment, they're the target. So they don't, you know, there is a concern that they go in with the police know what they're doing. So if the police have put those guys in the dock, they must be right. It's impossible to understand how Joe Steele could have got convicted for any other reason, because, I mean, I didn't realise how bad the evidence was until relatively recently, you know, the BBC documentary. Again, you know, a couple of verbals in a police car, you know, on the way to the station. Incredible that anybody could be convicted on the basis of that. But it was, and how long did it take? I mean, I never really even understood the basis for quashing the conviction.
The Thursday's first appeal.
I know. And I mean, it was a clear concern when you read the final appeal that they just took the view, well, he served enough time now anyway, you know. So, I mean, it's a bit late by that point when he served, what did he have, 23
or 24, Joe? I love it. Like, I've got so much time for Joe, 23 years or something that Joe Steele done. And I think it's often, like, I done a podcast with Patrick Maguire.
Yeah.
And I'm just like how, like, and I know again it's a public outcry. It's a public outcry, and it's like But when you actually read how bad it was in the way that they were going for Jerry Conlon, and Jerry Conlon only just mentioned a cousin, and that was it. The whole force. And I think even it's accepted now that it was set up because they couldn't get the IRA guys. The IRA guys were too hard to get. They were too good at what they were doing. So they had to get somebody.
Yeah.
And a lot of people would accept that's the case when that's very unacceptable in any system. Do you know what I mean?
And I mean, in those cases in particular, there was a kind of suspicion that the jury might have thought, well, we're not entirely sure they had anything to do with this particular crime, but they seem broadly sympathetic to the IRA, you know, who are blowing up civilians, so they'll do it for the moment, you know. I mean, it's impossible to read those cases without thinking that it might have been that they just thought, oh, they're close enough to that we're not letting them go, you know. But I mean, and to be fair to England, you know, that when these things happen in England, they do have a serious think about it and, you know, make reforms to try and avoid things being repeated. I don't get the impression that happens up here, you know. I mean, as I said, they spent a lot of time in England looking at the question of identification evidence. Here it was just, well, we don't really see it as a problem in Scotland, so, you know, carry on as was, and fingers crossed, you know, there'll be none of these cases up here. It's always a kind of arrogant, you know, used to tell us at university, Scots have got the best legal system in the world, and everybody loves their children's hearing system, and everybody loves the not proven verdict, and we're the envy of the world. You know, I'm no certain about that. I've never worked anywhere else, but I can detect a lot of major problems that nobody is addressing and never will address, because, you know, the SNP's position is victim-centred justice. You know, we're putting victims at the centre of the justice process. I like that, you know. I like that they're helping victims.
It's a good concept.
And it's a great pitch if you're trying to get votes, you know, that we're nice people, but they need to widen their observation. They need to look at, well, before it's established that somebody is a victim, you've got to have a trial, you know. So let's look at the fairness of the trial and not be influenced by they don't even know what the conviction rates are half the time, you know. They don't even keep proper statistics in relation to individual crimes, for example. But the ministers are prepared to say there is a major problem with conviction rates for this type of crime, and it just gets into the public psyche. And my worry is, you get cited for jury service and you find out it's a rape case, you're thinking, oh, there's a problem in this. You know, we've been hearing for years there's a problem. Not enough people are getting convicted of this. So if I find this guy not proven, I'm part of the problem. I'm contributing to the problem by adding to another acquittal. You know, and I'm not a psychologist, but that must be in close cases where it's 50-50. Some people might be thinking, oh, well, you know, they're always talking about this on Scotland Tonight and BBC, you know, that there's a dreadful conviction rate in Scotland, so I'm going guilty, you know, because I don't want to, if this is a problem, and I don't really understand it, but everybody seems to be agreed it's a problem, so I'm not contributing to the problem by giving another acquittal. I worry about that, and one of the reasons I don't do the cases any longer.
It's I know, no, and like, as we're coming up to the end, it's like, you look at, when I was in prison, you used to get, you'd maybe get a couple of people getting their convictions quashed for big cases. Maybe every few years you'd maybe have 2 or 3. Do you know what I mean? I couldn't tell you the last time I heard a big case getting quashed. Maybe John Jenkins or Craig McCreek, maybe, I don't know, like, but you're going way back, which then now, to me, is saying that you've got a perfect system.
Yeah. And it's real, as I said, it's a real uphill struggle, because they've now got a SIFT as well. So you don't even have a guarantee you're going to get to go into the appeal court and argue your case. You know, it's largely dealt with paperwork now, and vast majority, I don't know the figures, but if my practice is anything to go by, the vast majority of them are refused on the paperwork before you even get anywhere near the court, you know. There's also there's not a huge appetite. In Scotland's tiny, it's a tiny jurisdiction, and at any given time there's maybe 2 or 3 people who are really interested in doing appeal work. And that's a tiny
No,
number,
no.
isn't it? I've got no interest in doing it whatsoever.
Aye.
And most people who are doing trial work like me are no interested in it. I'll do my own, if somebody gets a hard time in sentence, I'm prepared to go in and have a fight to try and get the sentence reduced. I'll do that. Not interested in conviction appeals. They've made it to try and cut down the amount of time that's spent arguing them in court. It's so paper heavy. There are procedural hearings, It's a lot of work
No.
when you're getting into the thing pretty pessimistic because of your own experience and the reported cases where you're reading it and think, for God's sake, if that guy isn't getting his conviction quashed, what hope is there for anybody? It's kind of discouraging if somebody was to ask you. I mean, I've not got a reputation of doing them, so not many people do ask me, but a lot of, it's not really a career that many advocates or solicitor advocates are interested in it, to be perfectly honest,
And it makes sense. It's like, it'd be very disheartening. The money's no great. Like,
It's terrible.
It's like,
I never
why
mentioned
would you go?
I never mentioned it, but I mean, I've never made any decision in my career about money, but I'm not giving up somebody, a murder trial in Glasgow where the guy really, really wants me to do the trial, he go and roll about in the appeal court when I know I'm getting beat and I'm not getting paid for it. I'm not mad,
No, no.
There's no intellectual benefit in that. There's no financial benefit in it. In fact, it's the opposite. You're coming back in the train saying, I'm not going back there again.
Aye, but back with so good.
Aye, whereas I like working with juries, and it's a different thing standing up there, 3 judges, having a go at you when you're thinking, they've already made their mind up here, and there's nothing I can do about it. I've just got to stand here and put up a fight for the sake of the guy.
Aye.
When the two of us know there isn't the slightest possibility of us changing anybody's mind, I'm not interested in it. And it's plays into the problem that if you've got a case like yours, which, is a lot of work, of work, you're not going to find many lawyers in Scotland who are remotely interested in touching it, and especially you need a solicitor.
Aye.
Even worse for them, even worse for them. They're getting paid buttons. And,
my lawyer on my case, I'll give him a shout out, Grand Marquis, but he worked pro bono on my case.
Aye.
They stopped the illegal aid in that in my case.
Well, people will do that, but not everybody.
No,
and,
no.
To be fair to them, it's not just that they're hard-hearted. They've got staff and lights and
of
electricity
course.
and gas and everything. They can't do everything. for
Family
nothing.
and everything. I know.
So, they need to spend a lot of hours every day on paid employment just to keep the lights on.
It makes sense. It's no like it's no rocket science. But I think, see, the last question I'm going to ask you, Tom, just because, do you think that the public are sheltered from the problems that are going on in the background?
Absolutely, and I understand that. As I said, I don't know what the position is in terms of access to a variety of experts in the NHS, but I'll know when I need to know.
Aye.
And I think the public tend to regard the criminal justice system. I think the televised trials has been a big help.
Aye.
I mean, I fell into working in some of them, but it certainly wasn't my idea. But it's great because, I do get people saying to me, I never understood, I never knew that happened, or I never,
Aye.
there's an education in it, and it can't be completely education because nobody would watch it. So, I understand the way they handle it.
Aye.
But the feedback I got from the people was that the first one, it was about an hour of court footage and an hour of chat. And they said the public love the court footage. So
Aye.
if you've noticed the murder trial series, there's now about an hour and a half of court stuff. And we've also done a podcast on an audio where it's about 10 half-hour episodes. And it's helping because people, they're unlikely to drag themselves into Glasgow City Centre on a random basis in the hope they might see something interesting in court. But the minute it's on, the iPlayer, for example, they can watch it anytime. And, I'm certainly open to anybody who does watch any of that, who have got any questions about the criminal justice system. I'm easily contactable. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I've long thought about doing something like this where I explain aspects of the criminal justice system, and you've offered to help me with that. So
definitely. But no, so I'm just coming up there. If I missed anything, Tommy, that you would like to take it?
No, I think I've covered everything.
It was no. Listen, it's been an absolutely brilliant podcast. I've really enjoyed it. Where can people find you then?
Well, I'm at Glasgow Advocate on Twitter. That's probably the easiest place to find us, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tommy. Cheers. Thank you.